Picture this. It's a warm Saturday afternoon in Manhattan. Families spread blankets on the great lawn. Joggers circle the reservoir. Children climb rocks near Belvedere Castle. 843 acres of green space in the heart of the world's most famous city. 42 million visitors every year come to Central Park, making it the most visited urban park in America. But beneath your feet, there's a story that most people don't know. A story about communities destroyed, about lives lost during construction, about corruption so deep it helped define American politics, about crime, suicide, and secrets hidden in caves. This isn't the story they tell you on the carriage tours. Welcome to the dark history of Central Park. Today, we're going to walk through time, from the 1820s to the present day. We'll meet the people who lived where you now picnic. We'll discover how one of the most corrupt political machines in American history shaped this landscape. We'll learn about the workers who died building this paradise, and we'll explore the crimes that have haunted these paths for over a century and a half. This is a story about progress and its price, about democracy and displacement, about beauty built on erasure. So, before you take your next stroll through Central Park, before you snap another photo at Bow Bridge, let's uncover what really happened here. Because the ground you're standing on, it remembers everything. Chapter 1. Before the Park, Manhattan's Transformation. To understand Central Park's dark history, we've got to go back to a time before there was any park at all. Back to when Manhattan was a very different place. Let me paint you a picture of early 1800s New York City. In 1811, the population of Manhattan was around 97,000 people. Most of them lived crammed into the southern tip of the island. If you stood at what's now Times Square back then, you'd be looking at farmland, rocky outcrops, and scattered settlements. The city hadn't reached that far north yet, but New York was growing fast. Really fast. By 1850, less than 40 years later, the population had exploded to over 500,000 people. Think about that for a moment. The city had grown more than 5 times its size in just 4 decades. This wasn't gradual expansion. This was a population explosion. And where were all these new people coming from? Many were immigrants. Irish families fleeing the potato famine that had devastated their homeland in the 1840s. German immigrants seeking new opportunities. People from across Europe, all arriving in New York Harbor with dreams of a better life in America. But here's the thing about rapid growth. Cities weren't prepared for it. Lower Manhattan became desperately overcrowded. Tenement buildings packed families into tiny rooms with poor ventilation and no sanitation. Disease spread quickly through these cramped quarters. Cholera outbreaks killed thousands. The streets smelled of human waste and rotting garbage. There was almost no green space where people could breathe fresh air. The wealthy elite of New York looked at this situation and worried. Not just about public health, mind you, but about social unrest. They'd heard about the revolutions sweeping through Europe in 1848. They'd seen how class tensions could explode into violence. And they started thinking, maybe New York needed something to keep the peace. A place where different classes could mix peacefully. A safety valve for urban pressure. Enter the idea of a grand public park. The concept wasn't entirely new. European cities, especially London and Paris, had magnificent public gardens and parks. Hyde Park in London, the Tuileries in Paris. These were places where everyone, regardless of class, could enjoy nature and fresh air. Well, that's what people claimed anyway. In reality, even Europe's public parks often catered more to the wealthy than the poor. But the idea was attractive. In New York, poet and newspaper editor named William Cullen Bryant started championing the cause in the 1840s. Bryant wrote editorials in the New York Evening Post, arguing that the city desperately needed a large public park. He painted vivid pictures of what such a park could mean for New Yorkers: fresh air for people stuck in polluted streets, a place for families to gather, room for children to play, an oasis of nature in the growing concrete jungle. Bryant wasn't alone. In 1850, a landscape designer named Andrew Jackson Downing joined the campaign. Downing was a fascinating character. He published a magazine called The Horticulturist, which was popular among wealthy New Yorkers interested in gardening and design. But Downing thought bigger than just private gardens. He believed that beautiful public spaces could actually improve society. Downing had a theory, you see. He thought that if working-class people could experience the beauty of well-designed natural spaces, it would elevate them, morally and culturally. They'd become better citizens. They'd be less likely to turn to crime or revolution. It sounds paternalistic to our modern ears, and it was. But this was the kind of thinking that motivated many park advocates. Downing wrote passionate letters in his magazine about the need for what he called a people's park. He argued it would be Republican in spirit, democratic in nature, a place where all citizens, regardless of wealth, could enjoy the same beautiful landscape. He even traveled to Europe in 1850 to study parks there, returning with ideas about how to create something truly magnificent in New York. The park movement gained momentum quickly after 1850. That year turned out to be crucial, and the reasons why reveal something interesting about New York politics. Tammany Hall was the name of the Democratic Party's political machine in New York City. Think of it as a well-oiled organization that controlled city politics through a mix of genuine public service and blatant corruption. Tammany Hall provided jobs and assistance to immigrants in exchange for their votes. This made them very powerful. In 1850, Tammany made a calculated move. They nominated a man named Fernando Wood for mayor. Wood was ambitious, maybe too ambitious. He wanted to become the boss of all the Tammany bosses. He saw an opportunity in the park movement. If he supported creating a grand public park, he'd win support from both wealthy reformers and working-class voters who'd benefit from the green space. Wood lost that particular election to a Whig candidate named Ambrose Kingsland. But here's the interesting part. The park idea had become so popular that Kingsland also endorsed it. Both candidates were falling over themselves to support the park. The people wanted it, and politicians knew they had to deliver. On May 5, 1851, Mayor Kingsland sent a message to the New York City Common Council. He laid out the case for a large new park and urged the council to make it happen. The council's Committee of Lands endorsed the proposal. Now came the big question: where should this park go? The committee initially proposed a site called Jones's Wood. This was a beautiful, wooded tract of about 160 acres on the Upper East Side, between roughly 66th and 75th Streets, along the East River. People who'd visited described it as remarkably pristine, especially considering how close it was to the expanding city. The trees were old, the landscape was naturally attractive, and the waterfront location seemed ideal. But there were problems. The owners didn't want to sell. The site was relatively small compared to the grand parks of Europe, and the location on the east side meant it would be far from residents on the west side of the island. A bill was introduced in 1851 to take Jones's Wood through eminent domain. This is a legal power that allows the government to force the sale of private property for public use, as long as the owners are compensated. But the bill was challenged and eventually ruled unconstitutional. The Jones's Wood plan fell apart. Attention turned to a different location, a much larger tract of land in the center of Manhattan, between what would become 5th and 8th Avenues, stretching from 59th Street to 106th Street. This area was called simply the Central Park site. This land had some major advantages. First, it was bigger. About 778 acres initially, later expanded to 843 acres. That's more than 5 times the size of Jones's Wood. Second, it was more centrally located. People from both the east and west sides of Manhattan could access it relatively easily. Third, and this was important to penny pinchers, much of the land was considered undesirable for private development. Why undesirable? Because the terrain was difficult. The area was rocky, swampy in places, with steep hills and outcrops of Manhattan bedrock jutting out everywhere. These features made building homes or businesses expensive and impractical. The city already owned some of this land. What they didn't own, they figured they could acquire more cheaply than prime waterfront property like Jones's Wood. There was another advantage, though this one came with its own dark implications. The Central Park site wasn't empty. People lived there. But city leaders viewed these residents as relatively easy to displace. They were mostly poor, mostly immigrants, and many were people of color. In the calculus of 1850s New York politics, their rights and their homes didn't carry much weight. On July 21, 1853, the New York State Legislature passed the Central Park Act. This authorized the city to acquire the land through eminent domain. The Board of Commissioners began conducting property assessments on more than 34,000 lots in the area. This process took time, finally completing in July 1855. During these years, as the bureaucratic wheels turned slowly, the people living on this land waited. They watched as surveyors marked boundaries. They read newspaper articles about the coming park. They knew their time was limited. Who were these people? What were their lives like? That's the story we need to understand before we can grasp what was really lost when Central Park was created. Because this wasn't empty land being transformed into a park. This was a living, breathing community about to be erased from the map. And at the heart of that community was a place called Seneca Village. Chapter 2. Seneca Village, A Dream of Freedom. Let me take you back to the year 1825, 2 years before slavery would be officially abolished in New York State. In a city where free Black Americans faced constant discrimination, limited job opportunities, and the daily threat of violence, a remarkable thing happened. On a plot of land between what would later be called 82nd and 89th Streets, on the west side of Manhattan, 3 people made a purchase that would change history. Andrew Williams, a 25-year-old black shoe shiner, bought 3 lots of land for $125. Epiphany Davis, a store clerk, bought 12 lots for $578. And the African Methodist Episcopal Zion Church purchased 6 lots. Think about what this meant. In 1825 New York City, Black people faced enormous barriers to property ownership. They were denied loans by banks. Landlords refused to rent to them. Many jobs were closed to them. Housing options were limited to the most undesirable neighborhoods in lower Manhattan, where disease and overcrowding made life brutal and short. But now, these 3 buyers had done something radical. They'd acquired land, real property, in a time and place where that was nearly impossible for people who looked like them. The land they bought came from a couple named John and Elizabeth Whitehead, who decided to subdivide their property and sell it off, in small lots. Whether the Whiteheads were motivated by profit or genuine sympathy for Black New Yorkers seeking land, we don't know for certain, but the result was clear. They provided an opportunity that few others would have offered. Andrew Williams was young and ambitious. Working as a shoe shiner didn't pay much, but he'd saved every penny he could. Owning land wasn't just about having a place to live. In New York at that time, property ownership gave Black men the right to vote. You needed to own at least $250 worth of property to qualify. This was a restriction placed specifically on black voters, while white men could vote without owning property. It was discriminatory, yes, but it meant that property ownership was a pathway to political power, however limited. Word spread quickly through New York's black community. Here was land available for purchase. Land far enough from lower Manhattan to escape the worst of the city's problems. Land where you could build a home, raise a family, maybe even farm a little. Land where you could have a voice in elections. Over the next few years, more black families bought lots from the Whiteheads. By 1832, about half of the Whitehead property had been sold, mostly to African Americans. Homes started going up. Small, simple structures at first, but homes nonetheless. Real houses with foundations and walls and roofs. Places families could call their own. They named it Seneca Village. The origin of that name is somewhat mysterious. Some historians think it came from the Roman philosopher Seneca the Younger, whose writings were popular among abolitionists and black activists of the time. One of Seneca's letters, Letter 47, dealt with the treatment of slaves and was seen as a powerful statement about human dignity. For people fighting against slavery and discrimination, naming their community after this philosopher would have been meaningful. Others suggest the name might have come from the Seneca Nation of Native Americans, part of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. There are records suggesting that a few Native Americans lived in the area, though their presence was limited. There's also a darker theory. Some historians, including those at the Central Park Conservancy, note that Seneca might have been used as a slur. In the 1800s, racist language sometimes connected Native American names with black communities in derogatory ways. It's possible the village's name reflected this prejudice. A fourth possibility is that it came from Senegal, the West African nation. Some of the village's black residents might have been descended from people brought from Senegal during the slave trade. Naming their new community after their ancestral homeland would have been a powerful statement of identity and resistance. We'll probably never know for certain which explanation is correct. Maybe it was a combination of several. But what we do know is that Seneca Village quickly became something extraordinary. By the early 1830s, about 10 homes stood in the village. But this was just the beginning. Throughout the 1830s and 1840s, Seneca Village grew steadily. More black families arrived. And they weren't the only ones. Irish immigrants, fleeing poverty and famine in Ireland, also began settling in the area. German immigrants joined them. What emerged was a genuinely mixed community, something rare in 1800s New York where ethnic and racial groups typically stuck to separate neighborhoods. Let me give you a sense of what Seneca Village looked like at its peak. By 1855, approximately 225 people lived there. About 2/3 were black, 1/3 were Irish, with a small number of Germans. Over 50 homes dotted the landscape. These weren't shacks or temporary shelters. These were real houses, many of them owned by their residents. That last point is crucial. About half of Seneca Village's black residents owned their homes. Compare that to the wider reality of black life in 1850s New York, where home ownership was nearly impossible, and you start to understand how significant this was. These weren't just residents, they were property owners, stakeholders, citizens with rights. The village had 3 churches. The African Methodist Episcopal Zion Church was the first, buying land in that original 1825 purchase. This church represented one of the oldest black denominations in America, founded in New York City in 1796. Having a church in Seneca Village gave residents a spiritual center, yes, but also a political and social hub. Later, 2 more churches were built. All Angels Episcopal Church served a mixed congregation of black and white residents. Imagine that for a moment. In the 1840s and 1850s, when many churches were strictly segregated by race, all angels had people of different races worshiping side by side. The third church, St. Michael's Episcopal Church, also welcomed a diverse congregation. The village had 2 schools. One was associated with the churches, providing education to children who might otherwise have no access to schooling. Remember, public education for black children was severely limited in 1850s New York. Many schools were segregated and underfunded. Having schools in Seneca Village meant children could learn to read and write, skills that could open doors in a society that tried to keep those doors locked. The village also had 3 cemeteries. People were born in Seneca Village, lived their lives there, and were buried there. This was a complete community, not a temporary settlement. What did daily life look like? Based on archaeological evidence and historical records, we can piece together a picture. Many residents worked in Lower Manhattan, making the daily commute down the island to jobs as laborers, domestics, or craftspeople. Some residents farmed their plots of land, growing vegetables and raising chickens or pigs. There's evidence of fishing, too, since the Hudson River was close by. A spring called Tanner's Spring provided water for the community. Archaeological digs conducted in recent decades have uncovered fascinating artifacts. Beautiful glass bottles, suggesting residents had some disposable income for luxury goods. Fragments of Chinese export porcelain, showing they could afford imported items. An iron tea kettle and a roasting pan, tools of daily domestic life. And most poignantly, a small shoe with a leather sole and fabric upper, probably worn by one of the village's children. When that artifact was uncovered during a 2011 archaeological dig, one of the students working on the site started crying. It made the past suddenly, viscerally real. The village wasn't wealthy by any means. Most residents worked hard for modest incomes, but they had something many Black Americans could only dream of: stability, security, community, hope for the future. Think about what Seneca Village represented. In a nation still divided by slavery, with abolition still years away in many states, here was a community of free Black property owners. In a city rife with discrimination, here was a place where Black men could vote, where Black children could be educated, where Black families could build generational wealth through property ownership. It wasn't perfect. Discrimination didn't disappear just because you lived in Seneca Village. Residents still faced racism when they left the community. Job opportunities were still limited. The threat of violence was still real. Free Black people in New York lived under constant threat of being kidnapped and sold into slavery in southern states, a practice that was all too common. But within the boundaries of Seneca Village, people created something precious, a place of their own, a community where they supported each other, worshipped together, raised children together, and dreamed of a better future. Some historians believe Seneca Village may have been part of the Underground Railroad, the network of safe houses that helped enslaved people escape to freedom in the North and Canada. The evidence is speculative, but the theory makes sense. Seneca Village was far enough from the center of the city to provide some privacy. It had a strong sense of community and mutual aid. The African Methodist Episcopal Zion Church had connections to abolitionist networks. If enslaved people were being smuggled through New York on their way to freedom, Seneca Village would have been a logical place to hide them. The white residents of Seneca Village, mostly Irish and German immigrants, had their own reasons for living there. Many were fleeing poverty and seeking affordable land. The Irish, in particular, faced significant discrimination in 1840s and 1850s New York. No Irish need-apply signs were common. Irish immigrants were often portrayed in newspapers and cartoons as violent, drunken, and lazy. They were Catholic in a predominantly Protestant city, which brought its own prejudices. For Irish families, Seneca Village offered a chance at stability. They could buy or rent land more cheaply than in other parts of the city. They could live among people who understood the immigrant experience. And remarkably, they lived alongside black neighbors in what seems to have been relative harmony. Church records show white and black residents worshiping together at All Angels and St. Michael's. Census records show homes of different races clustered together without the rigid segregation that marked most of New York. Was there tension? Probably. The Irish community of 1850s New York was complex. Many Irish immigrants, facing their own oppression, competed with black Americans for low-wage jobs. This competition sometimes led to resentment and violence. The infamous New York draft riots of 1863 would see Irish mobs attacking black neighborhoods. But in Seneca Village, at least, there seems to have been coexistence. Shared circumstances created shared community. German immigrants rounded out Seneca Village's population. Germans were less numerous in the village, but present nonetheless. They brought different skills, different traditions, different languages to the mix. Like the Irish and black residents, they were seeking opportunity and stability. For 32 years, from 1825 to 1857, Seneca Village thrived. Children grew up there. Families celebrated weddings and mourned funerals. Gardens bloomed in spring. Smoke rose from chimneys in winter. Church bells rang on Sundays. It was an ordinary community in extraordinary circumstances, proving that people of different races and backgrounds could live together peacefully. But as the 1850s progressed, the residents of Seneca Village began to hear troubling news. Down in Lower Manhattan, powerful people were making plans. They wanted to create a magnificent public park, and they'd decided that Seneca Village stood in the way. The dream of Seneca Village was about to collide with the dream of Central Park, and in that collision, one dream would be crushed. Chapter 3. The Campaign of Destruction. Let me tell you about how you destroy a community without ever admitting you're doing anything wrong. The campaign to create Central Park began with noble rhetoric. Speeches about fresh air for the masses. Editorials about democratic values and shared public space. Plans for a people's paradise where New Yorkers of all classes could mingle peacefully. It sounded wonderful. Progressive, even. A bold vision for a modern city. But there was a problem that nobody wanted to talk about publicly. The chosen site for this people's paradise wasn't empty. About 1,600 people lived in the area marked for acquisition. Nearly 300 of them lived in Seneca Village alone. There were also other settlements scattered throughout the future park site. Irish families living in shanties. Bone-boiling establishments that processed animal remains. A convent and school run by Catholic. Sisters, small farms, piggeries. All of these would need to be removed before any park could be built. How do you justify displacing 1,600 people to create a public park? How do you convince the public that this is necessary and good? The answer, if you were 1850s New York politician and newspaper editor, was simple. You lied. You smeared. You dehumanized. Starting in the early 1850s, as the plan for Central Park gained momentum, newspapers began describing the park site in very particular language. They called it a wasteland. They described the area as rocky and swampy, which was partly true, but misleading. Yes, there were rocky areas. Yes, there were swamps. But there were also thriving communities with real houses, real churches, real schools. The newspapers went further. They began characterizing the people who lived on the park site as squatters and vagabonds, shanty dwellers who had no right to be there. This was a lie, and they knew it. Many Seneca Village residents owned their property legally. They had deeds, they paid property taxes, but calling them squatters made it easier to justify taking their land. The newspapers called the settlements shanty towns, suggesting ramshackle temporary structures inhabited by people too poor or lawless to live anywhere else. Again, this was deliberately misleading. While some people in the area did live in simple structures, Seneca Village had dozens of proper houses. The archaeological record proves this. When digs were conducted in recent decades, they found stone foundations, proper chimney structures, evidence of substantial buildings. These were homes, not shacks. The language grew harsher as the displacement drew closer. Newspapers called the residents tramps, thieves, and worse. They painted a picture of a dangerous, disorderly area that needed to be cleared for the public good. Cynthia Copeland, president of the Institute for the Exploration of Seneca Village History, has studied this period extensively. She's blunt about what happened. There was a smear campaign created in the media. They said, "We've got to get rid of all those people that live in the park that shouldn't be there. They are tramps, squatters, and thieves." This is the kind of language that they used. This wasn't accidental. This was a deliberate strategy to make displacement palatable to the public. If Seneca Village was full of hardworking property owners, respectable families, children attending school, if people knew that, they might object to destroying it. But if Seneca Village was a den of squatters and criminals, well, then clearing it out looked like urban renewal. The racial dimension of this smear campaign can't be ignored. Seneca Village was predominantly black. In 1850s America, racist stereotypes about black criminality and laziness were widespread. Newspapers regularly depicted black Americans as lazy, dangerous, and unable to maintain proper communities. By emphasizing the black population of Seneca Village and surrounding it with language about disorder and crime, the media tapped into these racist assumptions. The Irish residents of Seneca Village weren't spared either. Anti-Irish prejudice was strong in this period. Irish immigrants were often depicted as violent drunks, and their presence in an area was seen as evidence of its degradation. German immigrants faced less prejudice but were still considered foreign and potentially undesirable. The wealthy New Yorkers planning the park benefit from this smear campaign in multiple ways. First, it gave them moral cover for displacement. They weren't destroying thriving communities, they were cleaning up slums. Second, it deflected attention from their own financial interests. Many wealthy residents near the proposed park boundaries owned property that would skyrocket in value once the park was built. They stood to make fortunes. But the public conversation focused on the great democratic good of the park, not on the private profits of the elite. In 1853, when the Central Park Act passed, the die was cast. The city now had legal authority to take the land through eminent domain. Property assessments began. The Board of Commissioners started the process of determining how much to pay current landowners for their property. Here's where things get interesting. And by interesting, I mean deeply unfair. Eminent domain requires that property owners be compensated, yes. But who decides what's fair compensation? The government does. And the government's assessment of value often fell far short of what the property was actually worth. For Seneca Village residents, this was devastating. They'd bought their land at market prices. They'd built homes and established businesses. They'd created value. But the compensation offered often didn't reflect any of this. Some residents received payments that barely covered their original purchase price, never mind the improvements they'd made over the years. And remember, we're talking about people who'd had limited options for property ownership in the first place. They couldn't just take their compensation and buy equivalent property elsewhere. The same barriers that made Seneca Village special, the fact that it was one of few places Black Americans could own property, meant that losing it was catastrophic. The legal process ground on slowly. Property assessments, legal appeals, bureaucratic paperwork. The residents of Seneca Village and other settlements waited. They tried to fight back. There were petitions, legal challenges, but they were up against the combined power of the city government, the state legislature, wealthy landowners, and a media determined to paint them as undesirable. Some people think that because eminent domain involves compensation, it's fair. But think about what it means to be forced to sell your home, your community, the place where you've built your life and where you plan to build your future. Money doesn't replace that, especially when the amount offered is far less than what you need to recreate what you've lost. For Seneca Village residents, the situation was particularly grim. They'd created something rare and precious, a Black-owned community with political power through property ownership. Losing that didn't just mean losing homes. It meant losing voting rights. It meant scattering a community that had supported each other. It meant erasing a model of what Black success and self-determination could look like. By 1855, the writing was on the wall. The park was happening. Displacement was inevitable. Some residents had already begun to leave, taking whatever compensation they could get and trying to find new places to live. But many held on, hoping for a miracle. In 1857, 2 years after the property assessments were completed, the final eviction order came down. Mayor Fernando Wood, remember him? The ambitious politician who'd championed the park idea, he invoked eminent domain, and Seneca Village officially became city property. The residents of Seneca Village didn't leave quietly. According to historical accounts, they ignored the eviction orders for as long as they could. They battled the police sent to remove them. For 2 years, they resisted, using every legal and practical means they could find to delay the inevitable. Imagine being in their position. You've spent decades building something. You own your land legally. You've paid your taxes. You've been a good citizen, better than most. You've voted, gone to church, sent your kids to school, worked hard. And now the government is telling you to leave. Police are showing up at your door. Your neighbors are being dragged out of their homes. In August 1857, another order was issued. This time, it was final. The remaining residents of Seneca Village were forcibly removed. According to a description from the New York Public Library Research Guide, the remaining Black landowners were forcibly and violently scattered throughout the city. Forcibly and violently. Let that sink in. This wasn't a peaceful administrative relocation. People were forced out of their homes by police. Families were broken apart. Possessions were left behind. Lives were upended in brutal fashion. By the end of 1857, Seneca Village was empty. The houses stood vacant for a short time, and then demolition began. Workers tore down the structures. They filled in foundations. They uprooted gardens. They dismantled everything that had made Seneca Village a community. The 3 churches were destroyed. The schools were demolished. The cemeteries, remarkably enough, were mostly left intact initially, though their graves would be disturbed by construction. In 1871, workers digging up trees discovered 2 coffins about 14 inches beneath the surface. Inside were the bodies of 2 Black people from Seneca Village. One was identified by a plaque as Margaret McIntee, who died in February 1852 at age 16, just a teenager, buried in the community where she'd probably lived her whole short life. A half-century later, in the 1920s, a gardener named Gilhooly accidentally found more graves while turning soil in the same area. The spot became known as Gilhooly's burial plot. Even today, we don't know exactly where all of Seneca Village's cemeteries were located, or how many people were buried there. Their final resting places were paved over, landscaped over, lost to history. The residents of Seneca Village dispersed throughout New York City. We know very little about what happened to most of them. Did they find new homes? Did they remain in New York or leave the city entirely? Did families stay together or get separated? For most of them, the historical record is silent. They vanish from the archives, their fates unknown. Andrew Williams, the young shoeshiner who'd bought the first lots back in 1825, also disappears from records after the displacement. We don't know when he died or where. We don't know if he was ever able to rebuild what he'd lost. For over a century, Seneca Village was forgotten. Even New Yorkers who use Central Park regularly had no idea a thriving black community had once stood there. The park's official histories focused on Olmsted and Vaux, on design triumphs and landscaping genius. The people who'd been displaced were erased from the story. But here's an interesting thing about erasure. It's never quite complete. Those coffins kept turning up. The foundations kept showing up when construction workers dug too deep. The graves didn't disappear just because people stopped acknowledging them. The ground remembered what history tried to forget. It wasn't until 1992, nearly 150 years after the destruction of Seneca Village, that historians Roy Rosenzweig and Elizabeth Blackmar published The Park and the People, A History of Central Park. This book finally told Seneca Village's story in detail, bringing it back into public consciousness. In 2001, the Central Park Conservancy installed a historical marker commemorating Seneca Village. In 2019, they added more extensive signage, marking where homes and churches had once stood. These markers are still there today. If you visit Central Park and enter near the West 85th Street entrance, you'll find them. They tell a story that most park visitors never learned. In recent years, there's been growing interest in Seneca Village. Archaeological digs have uncovered thousands of artifacts. Historians have traced property records and church documents. The Institute for the Exploration of Seneca Village History, founded in 1998, has worked to keep the memory alive. There are now tours focused specifically on Seneca Village's history. Scholars study it as an example of Black achievement and community building in pre-Civil War New York. And in 2021, something remarkable happened. A man named Andrew Thomas Williams IV learned about his connection to the village. A researcher had found him through genealogy work and told him that he was the great-great-great-grandson of Andrew Williams, the original property owner. When Andrew Williams IV took a tour of the Seneca Village site, he couldn't help but share the news. I remember the tour guide saying, "We haven't been able to locate any descendants," he recalled with a laugh. His wife, Maria Williams, described how learning about their connection to Seneca Village made her feel. "It gave me a sense of being and a sense of pride. So, I walk a little taller and I feel a lot stronger." That's what Seneca Village represents today. Not just a story about displacement and loss, though it's certainly that, but also a story about resilience, achievement, and the refusal to be forgotten. The community was destroyed, yes, but its memory survived. And that memory stands as a rebuke to the easy narratives about progress and improvement that have always surrounded Central Park. Because here's the uncomfortable truth. Central Park was built on stolen land. Not stolen in the sense of being taken without legal process. The city followed the law, at least technically, but stolen in the sense that the law itself was unjust. Eminent domain was used to take land from people who'd fought hard to own it, who'd built their lives around it, who'd seen it as their pathway to security and citizenship. The park was paid for in part by these displaced communities, by Seneca Village residents who lost their homes, their community, their dreams. That cost is never mentioned in the official park literature. The beautiful lawns where people picnic today, they cover the ruins of a community that dared to dream of freedom and equality in a deeply unjust time. But Seneca Village wasn't the only community destroyed to make way for Central Park. There were other settlements, other lives disrupted, and as we'll see, the destruction was just the beginning. The real work of building the park was about to begin, and that work would come with its own dark history. Chapter 4. The Corrupt Machine, Tammany Hall and the Park. Let me tell you about William McGeer Tweed, though everyone called him Boss Tweed. If you want to understand the dark history of Central Park, you need to understand this man and the political machine he controlled. Tweed was born in New York City in 1823, the son of a chairmaker. He started as a bookkeeper and worked his way up through the ranks of Tammany Hall, the Democratic political organization that controlled New York City politics. By the late 1850s, just as Central Park construction was beginning, Tweed was becoming one of the most powerful men in the city. Tammany Hall operated on a simple principle: loyalty in exchange for favors. They helped immigrants get jobs, provided food to poor families, bailed people out of jail, and helped them navigate the complex bureaucracy of a city government. In exchange, these grateful recipients voted for Tammany candidates. It was a well-oiled machine that kept Democrats in power for decades. But Tammany wasn't just about helping people, it was about money. Enormous amounts of money. And few things generated as much opportunity for graft and corruption as large public works projects. Projects like, say, building an 843-acre park in the middle of Manhattan. In 1857, the same year Seneca Village was cleared, a design competition was held for Central Park. 33 proposals were submitted. The winning design came from Frederick Law Olmsted and Calvert Vaux, with their greensward plan. Olmsted would become the park's superintendent, overseeing construction. Vaux was the architect who'd handle the buildings and structures. Now, Olmsted is often portrayed as a visionary, a genius of landscape design who created a democratic paradise. And he was talented, no question. But he was also operating within a system of tremendous corruption, and he knew it. The Central Park Commission was supposed to oversee the park's construction, but real power lay with Tammany Hall and the politicians they controlled. Contracts for construction work, supplies, labor, these were all awarded through a system rife with kickbacks and payoffs. Companies that wanted to do business with the park paid bribes to Tammany officials. Those officials then steered contracts to friendly firms, who'd inflate their bills and split the excess with the politicians. Boss Tweed sat on the New York County Board of Supervisors starting in 1858. He quickly figured out how to exploit the park project. Here's how it worked. A construction company would submit a bill for, say, $50,000 for work that actually cost $20,000. The board would approve the inflated bill. The company would get paid $50,000, keep $20,000 for the actual work, and give the other $30,000 back to Tweed and his associates as a kickback. This happened over and over again. Contracts for stone, lumber, iron, labor, everything needed to build a massive park. Each contract was an opportunity for graft. By some estimates, corruption may have added anywhere from 30 to 45% to the park's total cost. Let me give you a sense of the scale. Central Park's construction cost about $14 million by the time it was largely completed in the early 1870s. That's roughly $400 million in today's money. If 30 to 45% of that was eaten up by corruption, we're talking about somewhere around $120 to $180 million in modern terms. Money that came from taxpayers and ended up in the pockets of corrupt politicians and their associates. Olmsted himself grew frustrated with the corruption. He complained about it in letters and reports. He saw contracts awarded to incompetent companies because they'd paid the right bribes. He watched as supplies that should have cost one price somehow cost double or triple. He knew workers were being exploited while contractors and politicians got rich. But Olmsted was also pragmatic. He needed Tammany's support to keep his position and to keep the park project moving forward. So he mostly kept his complaints private and focused on the design work he could control. It's an uncomfortable truth about Central Park. Even its most celebrated creator operated within, and to some degree, enabled a corrupt system. Boss Tweed's power grew throughout the 1860s. In 1863, he became the Grand Sachem of Tammany Hall, essentially its leader. He also served in the U.S. House of Representatives briefly and in the New York State Senate. By the late 1860s, he controlled nearly every aspect of New York City government through a network of loyal officials who became known as the Tweed Ring. The Tweed Ring included Peter Barr Sweeney, who controlled parks and public works, Richard Connolly, the city comptroller, who handled finances, and A. Oakey Hall, who was mayor. Together, they stole somewhere between $45 million and $200 million from the city treasury. The estimates vary because they were very good at hiding their tracks. In today's money, that's somewhere between $1 billion and $5 billion. Central Park wasn't their biggest scam. That honor probably goes to the New York County Courthouse, which should have cost a few $100,000 but somehow ended up costing $13 million, with most of that money disappearing into Tweed's pockets. But the park was a consistent source of graft throughout the 1860s. Here's an example of how brazen it got. In 1870, a carpenter named James Ingersoll was paid around $360,000 for work on the park. At least, that's what the record said. In reality, much of this money went straight to Tweed. Ingersoll got a cut for lending his name to the scheme. The actual carpentry work cost far less than what was billed. Or consider Andrew Garvey, known as the Prince of Plasterers. He was paid over $289,000 for plastering work. The New York Times later discovered that Garvey's bills included charges for plastering the same building multiple times, for materials never delivered, for work never done. Garvey was kicking back most of the money to Tweed. The newspapers of the day, particularly the New York Times and Harper's Weekly, began investigating the corruption. Thomas Nast, the famous political cartoonist, drew devastating caricatures of Tweed, depicting him as a bloated, greedy boss with a money bag for a head. These cartoons reached people who couldn't read the detailed financial exposés. Tweed allegedly said about Nast's cartoons, "Stop them damn pictures. I don't care so much what the papers say about me. My constituents can't read, but they can see pictures." The Times published detailed breakdowns of the corrupt contracts. They showed how companies with connections to Tweed received contracts at inflated prices. They revealed the kickback schemes. They named names. In 1871, a disgruntled Tammany insider leaked detailed financial records to the Times. These records proved beyond doubt what everyone had suspected. The Tweed Ring was systematically looting the city treasury. The evidence was overwhelming. Public outrage exploded. Reform candidates swept the next elections. In 1872, Boss Tweed was arrested and put on trial. He was convicted of stealing public funds and sentenced to 12 years in prison. He served only a year before being released on a technicality, but was then arrested again on civil charges. While awaiting trial, he escaped and fled to Spain. Here's where it gets interesting. Spanish authorities didn't know who Tweed was, but they'd seen Thomas Nast's political cartoons, which had been reprinted internationally. When they encountered this heavy-set American fugitive, they recognized him from the cartoons and arrested him. He was extradited back to New York and thrown in Ludlow Street Jail, where he died in 1878 at age 55. The fall of the Tweed Ring marked a turning point in New York politics. But the damage to Central Park's construction had already been done. Millions of dollars that should have gone to workers' wages, to quality materials, to proper construction had been siphoned off into private pockets. This affected the park in tangible ways. Some structures were built with inferior materials because contractors pocketed the difference between quality supplies and cheap alternatives. Workers were sometimes underpaid, or wages were delayed because money was being diverted. The construction timeline was extended because inefficient companies with the right political connections got contracts instead of competent firms. And here's something else to consider. The workers who actually built Central Park, the laborers who moved earth and placed stone, and planted trees, they paid the price for this corruption. Not just in terms of potentially lower wages, but in terms of safety and working conditions. Which brings us to the next dark chapter of Central Park's history, the construction itself. Because building this massive park wasn't just expensive and corrupt, it was dangerous. And for many of the workers who created this urban paradise, the park became their grave. Chapter 5. Blood and Stone, the Workers Who Built Paradise. Let me tell you what it took to build Central Park. And I mean really build it. Not the polished story you hear about visionary designers and democratic ideals. I'm talking about the actual physical labor of transforming rocky, swampy terrain into manicured landscapes. Construction began in earnest in 1858. The clearing of Seneca Village and other settlements had just been completed. Now came the enormous task of reshaping the land itself. Picture the site as it was. 843 acres of rough terrain. Massive outcrops of Manhattan schist, the bedrock that underlies the island, jutted out everywhere. Swampy areas created by poor drainage made large sections nearly impassable. The elevation varied wildly, with steep hills and deep valleys. There were very few trees. The area had been logged and farmed for decades, so most of the picturesque woodland you see today had to be planted from scratch. Olmsted and Vaux's greensward plan called for transforming all of this into a carefully designed landscape. They wanted rolling meadows, serene lakes, winding paths, dense woodland areas, rocky outcrops left in picturesque positions, and open spaces for public gatherings. It was an ambitious vision. Some would say impossibly ambitious. To make it happen, they needed workers. Lots of workers. And they needed them to do backbreaking labor with the tools and technology of the 1850s and 1860s. At the peak of construction, around 3,000 to 4,000 workers labored on the park every day. Over the course of construction, which lasted roughly from 1858 to 1873 for the main work, with refinements continuing for years after, approximately 20,000 men worked on the project at one time or another. Who were these workers? Mostly Irish immigrants. New York in the 1850s and 1860s had an enormous Irish population, many of them recent arrivals fleeing the famine. These men were desperate for work and willing to do jobs that others wouldn't. They also faced discrimination that limited their job options. Working on Central Park paid maybe $1 to $1.50 per day. Not much, but better than nothing. German immigrants also worked on the park in significant numbers. There were some native-born Americans, and notably, there were free black laborers. Some of these may have been former residents of Seneca Village, men who'd lost their homes, and now were hired to build the park that had displaced them. Think about that irony for a moment. The work was brutal. Let me describe what these men did every day. First, there was the blasting. Those outcrops of Manhattan bedrock. Many of them had to be removed or reshaped. The only way to break apart solid rock in the 1850s was with explosives. Workers would drill holes into the stone by hand, using hammers and iron chisels. This was slow, exhausting work. Once the holes were drilled, workers would pack them with gunpowder, light a fuse, and run. Sometimes the fuses burned too fast. Sometimes they burned too slow, and workers thought they'd gone out, only to have them explode when someone approached. Sometimes the blasting triggered larger rock falls than expected. Men died in these explosions. How many? We don't know exactly because record keeping was poor, especially for injuries and deaths among laborers. Over the entire construction period, workers detonated more than 2,325 explosions. That's roughly one explosion every other day, for 16 years. Each one posed risks to the workers nearby. After the rock was blasted, workers had to remove it. They loaded rubble into carts and wagons, hauled it to other parts of the park, and used it for construction projects like walls and bridges. This work built muscle, sure, but it also broke bodies. Lifting heavy stone all day, every day, led to back injuries, hernias, crushed hands and feet when stone slipped. The park required massive earth moving. Olmsted and Vaux wanted to create specific topography. Hills here, valleys there, level meadows in other spots. This meant moving earth on an enormous scale. By the time construction was largely complete, workers had moved somewhere between 5 million and 10 million cubic yards of soil and rock. Think about that number, 10 million cubic yards. Picture a cube of earth roughly 70 feet on each side, then imagine around 10 million of those cubes being dug up and moved by hand. How did they move all this earth? With picks, shovels, and wheelbarrows. Some horse-drawn carts helped, but much of the work was pure human labor. Men dug into hillsides, loaded wheelbarrows, pushed them to new locations, and dumped them. Hour after hour, day after day for years. This kind of repetitive heavy labor caused injuries that might not seem dramatic but were crippling nonetheless. Muscle strains, joint damage, chronic back pain. In an era before workers' compensation or disability insurance, these injuries could mean losing your job and falling into desperate poverty. The park needed water features, lots of them. The lake, the pool, the Harlem Mere, the Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis Reservoir. Most of these didn't exist naturally. They had to be excavated and filled. Workers dug out massive amounts of earth to create these features, then built systems to fill them with water. Drainage was a constant problem. The swampy areas of the park site didn't become meadows just because someone designed them that way. Workers had to install drainage systems, miles and miles of underground pipes to carry water away. This meant digging trenches, often through rocky soil, laying pipes, and covering them back up. Men working in trenches faced the constant risk of cave-ins, being buried alive when walls of earth collapsed. The park has 36 bridges and arches, each one a small engineering marvel. Workers built these structures stone by stone. They hauled the stone to the sites, shaped it, lifted it into place. Some of these bridges span significant heights. Working at elevation without modern safety equipment meant falls were common. Let me tell you about an incident that illustrates the dangers. In 1860, a worker named John Bradley was helping construct one of the park's bridges. The exact details are murky. Records from the time are incomplete, but what we know is that Bradley fell from the structure he was working on. He dropped maybe 20 or 30 feet onto rock below. He died from his injuries. Bradley wasn't the only one. Throughout construction, workers fell from bridges, were hit by falling stones, were caught in explosions, were crushed by carts, drowned in partially constructed water features. The exact death toll isn't known because nobody kept comprehensive records. Laborers were seen as expendable. When one died, another was hired to take his place. What we do know is that the park was built during an era of minimal worker safety regulations. There were no hard hats, no safety harnesses, no guardrails on bridges under construction, no safety protocols for working with explosives. Workers brought their own tools and worked in whatever clothes they had. If you got injured, you were on your own. No compensation, no medical care beyond basic first aid, no pension for your family if you died. The work was seasonal too. Construction slowed or stopped in winter when the ground froze. This meant workers faced periods of unemployment every year. They had to save money from their meager wages to get through the winter or find other work, which wasn't easy given how many other laborers were in the same situation. Disease was another killer. Workers labored in swampy conditions, breeding grounds for mosquitoes carrying malaria and other diseases. Cholera outbreaks swept through New York regularly in the 1850s and 1860s. Yellow fever appeared periodically. Living in crowded tenements and working in close quarters with other laborers meant disease spread quickly. There's a grimness to imagining what a typical workday looked like. You'd wake up before dawn in a crowded tenement. Maybe you'd have some bread and weak coffee if you were lucky. Then you'd walk to the park, maybe a few miles if you lived in lower Manhattan. You'd work from sunrise to sunset, with maybe a short break for lunch. Your hands would blister from shoveling. Your back would ache from lifting. In summer, you'd bake under the sun. In winter, before work stopped for the season, you'd freeze. And at the end of the day, you'd collect your $1 or $1.50. Some of that would go to your landlord for rent. Some would go to food. If you had a family, you'd need to stretch it to feed them too. There'd be nothing left to save, nothing to build a future with. You were surviving, not thriving. For workers, Central Park was just a job. They weren't building it because they believed in the democratic vision or wanted to create a paradise. They were building it because they needed to eat. The grand ideals meant nothing to a man whose hands were bleeding from swinging a pickaxe all day. And remember, much of the money that should have gone to these workers' wages was being stolen by Boss Tweed and his associates. The corruption I described earlier didn't just enrich politicians, it came directly out of workers' pockets. Every dollar skimmed off in kickbacks was a dollar that could have paid better wages or improved working conditions. Frederick Law. Olmsted, for all his design genius, had a complicated relationship with the workers. He pushed them hard. He demanded high standards. He wanted the park built according to his vision, and he didn't always concern himself with the human cost. There are accounts of Olmsted clashing with workers, complaining about their pace, threatening to fire people who didn't meet his expectations. To be fair to Olmsted, he was under enormous pressure. He answered to the Central Park Commission and to politicians who wanted results. He was fighting against corruption that diverted resources. He was trying to create something unprecedented. But the workers bore the brunt of that pressure. There were some efforts to improve conditions. Olmsted did set up a small infirmary on site for treating injured workers. He hired a surgeon to provide medical care. But these were minimal measures. Band-aids on a system that fundamentally didn't value workers' lives and safety. The trees you see in Central Park, today, the 400,000 or so trees and shrubs, many of them were planted by these workers. They dug holes, hauled saplings, planted them, watered them. It was more pleasant work than blasting rock, but still physically demanding. And they had to do it, knowing that they'd probably never benefit from the shade these trees would eventually provide. The park was being built for future generations, for the wealthy and middle class who'd have leisure time to enjoy it. The workers building it were too busy surviving to take a stroll in the park. By the early 1870s, the major construction work was done. The park opened in sections as they were completed, so New Yorkers were already using parts of it while other parts were still under construction. Workers moved on to other jobs. Many of them probably never returned to the park they'd built. Why would they? It was just a reminder of years of backbreaking labor for minimal pay. The workers who built Central Park left almost no trace. In the official histories, Olmsted and Vaux got statues and monuments. Their names are celebrated. But try to find the names of the workers who actually moved the earth, placed the stones, planted the trees. You can't. They're anonymous, forgotten. Their only monument is the park itself, and even that doesn't acknowledge them. In recent years, there's been some effort to remember these workers. Historical markers mention them in general terms. Academic histories discuss the labor that went into construction, but we'll never know most of their names. We'll never know how many died. We'll never know their individual stories. What we do know is this: Central Park was built on their backs. Every path you walk, every bridge you cross, every tree you rest under exists because thousands of men gave years of their lives to hard labor for minimal reward. Some gave their lives entirely, dying in accidents that were never properly recorded or remembered. The park stands as a monument to design genius, yes, to democratic values, supposedly, but it's also a monument to exploitation, to a system that valued grand visions over human welfare, to an era when workers' lives were considered expendable in pursuit of progress. And the dark history of Central Park wasn't finished yet, because once the park was built and opened to the public, a whole new set of problems emerged. The paradise that had been promised turned out to have some very dark corners indeed. Chapter 6. The Dark Corners. Crime and Danger in the Park. Central Park opened to the public gradually as sections were completed. The first areas opened in the late 1850s, even while construction continued elsewhere. By 1873, the park was largely finished and fully accessible. New Yorkers flocked to this new amenity. On pleasant weekends, tens of thousands of people would visit. From the beginning, there were problems. Problems that the park's planners hadn't fully anticipated or had chosen to ignore. First, let's talk about class conflict. Central Park was supposed to be democratic, a place where all classes would mingle peacefully. The reality was more complicated. The wealthy arrived in carriages, dressed in their finest clothes, using the park as a place to see and be seen. The working class came on foot, often in their everyday work clothes, looking for a bit of green space and fresh air. These two groups didn't always mix well. The wealthy complained that working-class visitors were too rowdy, that they didn't respect the park's genteel atmosphere. They objected to immigrant families holding loud gatherings, to young men playing rough games, to anyone who didn't conform to upper-class standards of behavior. The park authorities responded by creating rules that effectively limited working-class use. They banned many activities that working-class visitors enjoyed, like ball games and large group gatherings without permits. They enforced dress codes in certain areas. They scheduled activities and concerts at times when working-class people would be at their jobs. Carriageway traffic got priority over pedestrians. The park police, established in 1858, enforced these rules selectively, often harassing working-class and immigrant visitors while ignoring similar behavior by wealthy patrons. So the democratic ideal of Central Park was undermined from the start. It was technically open to everyone, but designed and managed in ways that favored the wealthy. This created resentment and tension, but class conflict was the least of the park's problems. Because from the very beginning, Central Park had a crime problem. Let me be clear about something. Central Park was and is generally safe. Millions of people use it every year without incident. The vast majority of visits are peaceful and pleasant. But the park's size, its isolated areas, and its hours of operation have always made it attractive to criminals. Let's start with the basics. 843 acres is a huge amount of space. Much of it is densely wooded or features rocky, secluded areas. The Ramble, a 38-acre section of heavily wooded paths and rock formations, was designed to feel wild and remote. That's wonderful for creating a sense of escape from the city. It's less wonderful for public safety. From the 1860s onward, there were reports of robberies in the park. Muggers would wait in secluded spots for isolated victims. They'd demand money or valuables, sometimes using weapons. The park's winding paths made escape easy. A criminal could rob someone, then disappear into the trees or rocky outcrops before police could respond. Assaults also occurred. Sometimes these were random attacks. Sometimes they were targeted. Women walking alone in isolated areas were particularly vulnerable. There are historical accounts of women being attacked, robbed, or worse, in the park's more remote sections. The park police force was established to combat these problems, but they faced challenges. The park was too large to patrol effectively. There weren't enough officers to cover all the isolated areas. And the force itself was plagued by corruption. Remember, this was the era of Tammany Hall, so park police jobs were often given as political favors to men who weren't necessarily qualified or particularly interested in actually protecting people. Night brought additional dangers. The park officially closed at dusk, but enforcement was difficult. People could and did enter the park after dark. Some were lovers seeking privacy. Others were homeless people looking for shelter. And some were criminals using the cover of darkness to commit crimes. The Ramble became particularly notorious. Its dense woods and winding paths, so attractive during the day, became threatening at night. There were areas where even park police were reluctant to patrol after sunset. The Ramble's reputation as a dangerous place after dark persists to this day, but it wasn't just street crime that plagued the park. Central Park also attracted people in desperate circumstances, and sometimes that desperation led to tragedy. Suicide in Central Park has been a persistent problem since the park opened. The reasons are complicated. Some people chose the park because it was a beautiful place to end their lives, seeking some kind of peace in their final moments. Others chose it because its size and isolated areas offered privacy. Still, others jumped from the park's bridges. The exact number of suicides in Central Park's history is impossible to determine. Many weren't reported in newspapers, especially in earlier eras when suicide was considered shameful, and newspapers often avoided printing such stories. But we know there were many. Cave areas in the park became known as spots where troubled individuals went. There's a cave system beneath parts of the park, including in the Ramble area. These natural formations in the Manhattan bedrock created hollow spaces where people could hide. Historical accounts mention finding bodies in these caves, people who'd taken their own lives in these dark, hidden spots. One particular cave gained an especially dark reputation. Local folklore called it the Suicide Cave, though its exact location has been somewhat lost to history. According to stories passed down, multiple people ended their lives there over the decades. Whether these stories are entirely accurate is hard to say. Folklore has a way of exaggerating, but they reflect a real pattern of suicides occurring in the park's most hidden places. The park's isolation also made it attractive to people looking to hide bodies. There are cases throughout the park's history of murder victims being discovered in remote areas. A body dumped in the Ramble or the North Woods might go undiscovered for days or weeks, giving the killer time to escape. Let me tell you about a case that shocked New York. In August 1986, 18-year-old Jennifer Levin was found strangled behind the Metropolitan Museum of Art, technically just outside Central Park but in an area used as parkland. She'd been killed by Robert Chambers, who became known as the Preppy Killer. The case dominated headlines for months. Chambers eventually pleaded guilty to manslaughter and served 15 years in prison. The Levin case wasn't unique. Throughout the park's history, there have been murders, assaults, and disappearances. Each one reminds New Yorkers that this urban oasis isn't always safe. The park has also been the site of sexual assaults. Again, the exact number is impossible to determine because many sexual assaults go unreported. But we know from police records and newspaper accounts that the park's isolated areas have been used by predators. In April 1989, a case occurred that would become one of the most controversial and painful episodes in New York history, the Central Park jogger case. A 28-year-old woman was jogging in the park around 9 p.m. when she was brutally attacked, raped, and beaten. She was left for dead and wasn't discovered until several hours later. She'd lost so much blood that doctors didn't expect her to survive. Miraculously, she did survive, though she had no memory of the attack and suffered lasting injuries. 5 teenagers, 4 Black and 1 Hispanic, were arrested and eventually convicted of the crime. They became known as the Central Park Five. The case inflamed racial tensions in New York. Many people believed the teenagers were guilty. Others believed they were innocent, victims of a rush to judgment and coerced confessions. In 2002, a convicted rapist and murderer named Matias Reyes, who was serving a life sentence for other crimes, confessed to being the sole attacker of the jogger. DNA evidence confirmed his confession. The Central Park Five were exonerated. They'd served between 6 and 13 years in prison for a crime they didn't commit. The case revealed deep problems in the criminal justice system: coerced confessions, false evidence, racial bias, and a rush to judgment driven by public pressure and media hysteria. But it also revealed something about Central Park itself. The attack happened because the jogger was alone in an isolated part of the park after dark. The park's very design, its deliberately wild and secluded areas, made such attacks possible. These high-profile crimes have shaped public perception of Central Park. For decades, particularly from the 1970s through the 1990s, many New Yorkers avoided the park after dark. The park's reputation as dangerous was widespread. Parents warned children not to go there alone. Guidebooks cautioned tourists about safety. The park also became known as a place where drug deals happened. In the 1970s and 1980s, when New York City was struggling with crack cocaine and heroin epidemics, dealers used the park's isolated spots to conduct transactions. Users would go there to consume drugs. This created additional safety concerns for regular park visitors. Homelessness has always been an issue in Central Park. From the park's earliest days, people without shelter would sleep there. During economic depressions, the numbers would swell. In the 1930s, during the Great Depression, homeless encampments sprouted in the park. Makeshift villages of desperate people. These became known as Hoovervilles, named mockingly after President Herbert Hoover, who was blamed for the Depression. More recently, homeless people continue to live in the park, despite efforts by authorities to prevent it. They sleep under bridges, in wooded areas, anywhere they can find shelter. This isn't just a law enforcement problem. It's a humanitarian issue. People are living in the park because they have nowhere else to go. But their presence, along with the mental health and substance abuse issues many struggle with, adds to concerns about park safety. The park authorities in New York City have tried various approaches to address these problems over the decades. They've increased police patrols. They've installed better lighting in some areas. They've created programs to connect homeless people with services. They've launched initiatives to make the park feel safer and more welcoming. In the 1980s, Central Park was in particularly rough shape. The city was broke, unable to maintain the park properly. Graffiti covered bridges and buildings. Trash piled up. Lawns turned to dirt. Many of the park's features fell into disrepair. The park felt dangerous, and crime statistics bore that out. Then, in 1980, a private organization called the Central Park Conservancy was formed. This nonprofit took on responsibility for managing and maintaining the park through a partnership with the city. They raised private funds, mobilized volunteers, and began a comprehensive restoration effort. The Conservancy's work has been remarkable in many ways. They've restored buildings, replanted gardens, cleaned up paths, and improved lighting and signage. They've brought in more staff and programming. By most measures, the park is in far better shape today than it was in the 1980s. But the Conservancy model raises its own questions. Central Park is technically a public park, owned by the city, for all New Yorkers. Yet it's largely managed and funded by a private organization that relies heavily on donations from wealthy New Yorkers. This creates a two-tier system where Central Park gets excellent care, while parks in poorer neighborhoods are neglected. There's also been criticism that the Conservancy's improvements cater to wealthy users. The programs they fund, the events they host, the aesthetic choices they make, all tend to align with upper-class preferences. The park has become safer and more beautiful, yes, but it's also become more exclusive in subtle ways. The democratic ideal that supposedly motivated its creation feels more distant than ever. Still, from a safety perspective, the park is much improved from its low point in the 1970s and 1980s. Crime rates in the park have dropped dramatically, mirroring citywide trends. Better policing, better maintenance, and better lighting have all helped. The park is used more heavily now, and that increased presence of legitimate visitors acts as a deterrent to crime. But the park can't escape its geography and design. Those 843 acres include numerous isolated spots. The Ramble remains densely wooded and maze-like. The North Woods, the park's most remote section, feels genuinely wild. These features are what make Central Park special, what create that sense of escape from urban life. But they also create vulnerability. Even today, park authorities recommend that visitors stick to well-traveled paths, especially after dark. Women are advised not to jog alone in isolated areas. Parents are told to supervise children carefully. These warnings exist because the danger, while reduced, hasn't disappeared entirely. The park's dark history of crime isn't just about individual incidents. It's about the tension between the park's design and its reality. Olmsted and Vaux wanted to create a pastoral escape. They succeeded. But they created spaces that are necessarily isolated and hard to police. There's no way around this trade-off. The things that make the park beautiful, the winding paths, the dense woods, the rocky outcrops, are the same things that make it potentially dangerous. And there's another aspect of the park's dark history that we need to discuss, one that reveals yet another tension between ideals and reality. Central Park was supposed to be for everyone, but from the beginning, not everyone has felt equally welcome there. And for some groups of New Yorkers, the park has been a site not just of danger, but of exclusion and persecution. Chapter 7. Exclusion and Resistance, Who the Park Was Really For. The promises about Central Park being a democratic space, where all New Yorkers could mingle freely, those promises began to unravel almost immediately. Because, you see, there's a difference between saying a park is open to everyone and actually making everyone feel welcome there. From its earliest years, Central Park struggled with who it was really serving. The design itself revealed certain assumptions. Olmsted and Vaux created separate zones for different activities. There were carriage roads for the wealthy who owned horses and buggies. There were pedestrian paths for walking. There were open meadows where, theoretically, anyone could gather. But the rules that governed the park told a different story. The park authorities established regulations that reflected upper-class Victorian sensibilities. No ball playing in most areas, no group gatherings without permits, no loud behavior, strict dress codes for certain sections. These weren't neutral rules. They were designed to exclude or control behaviors associated with working class and immigrant New Yorkers. Black New Yorkers faced particular challenges. Remember, many black residents of Seneca Village had been displaced to create this park. Now, when they tried to use it, they often encountered hostility. There weren't explicit whites-only signs. This was the North, not the South. But the message was communicated in subtler ways. Park police harassed black visitors, questioning their right to be there. White visitors complained when they saw black families using the same facilities. Newspapers ran articles suggesting that certain types of people, code for Black, Irish, and other minorities, were making the park unsafe or unpleasant. The wealthy New Yorkers who championed the park had imagined a space where different classes would learn from each other. The working class would be uplifted by seeing how the upper class behaved. But they hadn't really imagined genuine equality. What they wanted was a social laboratory where hierarchy would be maintained even in, supposedly, public space. Throughout the late 1800s and early 1900s, Central Park reflected the racial tensions of American society. The park was technically integrated, but socially segregated. Black families learned to stick to certain areas where they were less likely to face harassment. White families dominated the prime spots. The Irish immigrants who'd built much of the park with their labor found themselves similarly unwelcome. Anti-Irish sentiment ran high in late 1800s New York. The Irish were Catholic, which offended Protestant sensibilities. They were associated with crime and drunkenness, unfair stereotypes that nonetheless shaped how they were treated. When Irish families gathered in the park, especially in large groups, park authorities often intervened to break them up. There's a fascinating tension here. Central Park was built partly as a response to fears about class conflict. The wealthy worried that if poor people had no public spaces, they might riot, so they created this park, this pressure valve. But then they tried to control how poor people used it, which created its own resentments. Let me tell you about the Sunday concerts. Starting in 1859, the park began hosting free concerts on Sundays. These were wildly popular. Thousands of working-class New Yorkers would attend, one of the few entertainments they could afford. But the concerts revealed all the park's tensions. Wealthy concert-goers arrived early and claimed the best seats. Working-class attendees who couldn't leave work early got whatever spots were left. Complaints flew about behavior. Working-class audiences were too noisy, too enthusiastic, not refined enough. There were calls to cancel the concerts or restrict attendance. Eventually, the concerts were moved and restructured in ways that made them less accessible to working people. The park's treatment of women was also revealing. In Victorian-era New York, respectable women weren't supposed to be alone in public spaces. They needed male chaperones. This rule was enforced inconsistently, but women who violated it, especially working-class women, faced harassment from park police and from other visitors. Women who worked as domestics might have Sunday afternoons off. They'd want to enjoy the park, but they'd be viewed with suspicion. Were they prostitutes? Were they meeting men inappropriately? Park authorities kept close watch on any woman who seemed to be alone or behaving in ways that violated gender norms. The park's design included some features supposedly for women's benefit. The ladies' pond was created as a place where women could ice skate away from male eyes. But this segregation reinforced ideas about women needing protection and not being able to share space equally with men. Children's use of the park was also controlled along class lines. Wealthy children could play freely, supervised by nannies. Working-class children were viewed as potential troublemakers. The park had rules against certain games and activities that working-class kids enjoyed. Baseball was banned in most areas. Tag and other running games were restricted. The message was clear: your play, your joy needs to conform to our standards. Let's talk about what happened in the early 1900s. By this time, massive waves of immigration from Eastern and Southern Europe had transformed New York's demographics. Italian, Jewish, Polish, Russian immigrants, these groups had their own cultural practices, their own ways of using public space. They came to Central Park in large family groups. They brought food and had picnics that lasted hours. They played music, spoke in foreign languages, engaged in animated conversations. To the WASP elite who designed the park, this behavior was alarming. It threatened their vision of what the park should be. There were calls for stricter enforcement of rules. More park police were hired. Permits for group gatherings became harder to obtain. Signs went up in multiple languages, telling people what they couldn't do. The subtext was always the same. This is our park, and you need to use it our way. The park became a site of cultural conflict. Different groups laid claim to different areas. The North Meadow might be dominated by Italian families on Sunday afternoons. The mall attracted German immigrants who enjoyed promenading. Irish families gathered near certain playgrounds. These informal territories were defended jealously. Sometimes the conflicts turned violent. There are records of fights breaking out between different ethnic groups, each claiming the right to a particular space. Park police would intervene, but their interventions often reflected their own biases about which groups were causing problems. African Americans continued to face the most consistent discrimination. Through the early and mid-1900s, Black New Yorkers used the park, but always with awareness that they might face hostility. Black families couldn't relax fully. They had to be constantly aware of how they were being perceived, how they were being judged. There's a painful irony here. The park had been built partly on land taken from a black community. Now, Black New Yorkers trying to use that park faced discrimination and harassment. The Democratic vision? It was a lie, or at least a heavily qualified truth. The park's use by LGBTQ New Yorkers is another chapter in this history of exclusion and resistance. From the early 1900s onward, the park became one of few semi-safe spaces for gay men to meet. The Ramble, with its dense foliage and winding paths, offered privacy that was hard to find elsewhere in the city. This use came with enormous risks. Homosexual activity was illegal. Gay men could be arrested, imprisoned, lose their jobs, be publicly shamed. Park police conducted regular sweeps, arresting men for indecency or lewd conduct. Sometimes these were legitimate arrests of people engaged in illegal public sexual activity. Often, they were arrests of men who were simply talking to each other or walking together. The park became a hunting ground for police looking to make vice arrests. They'd use decoys, plainclothes officers who'd strike up conversations with gay men and then arrest them. These tactics were legal at the time, considered good police work, but they created an atmosphere of terror for LGBTQ people trying to find community. Despite the risks, the park remained important to LGBTQ New Yorkers. It was one of the few places they could be themselves, even briefly. The cat-and-mouse game with police continued for decades. Gay men developed signals, ways of recognizing each other, strategies for avoiding arrest. The Ramble's very design, meant to create romantic natural scenes, inadvertently created spaces where marginalized people could exist. This continued well into the late 1900s. The Stonewall riots happened in 1969, marking the beginning of the modern LGBTQ rights movement. But discrimination in Central Park didn't end. Through the 1970s and 1980s, gay men still faced harassment and arrest. The AIDS crisis of the 1980s added another layer of stigma. Gay men using the park were viewed not just as criminals but as disease carriers. It's only been in recent decades that Central Park has become genuinely welcoming to LGBTQ people. The park now hosts LGBTQ events. There are memorials to LGBTQ pioneers. But that acceptance came after more than a century of exclusion and persecution. Let me tell you about a more recent incident that captures all these historical tensions. In May 2020, a black birdwatcher named Christian Cooper was in the Ramble. He was doing what birdwatchers do, looking for birds. He noticed a white woman, Amy Cooper, no relation, walking her dog off-leash, which violated park rules. Christian Cooper asked Amy Cooper to leash her dog. She refused. He started recording the interaction on his phone. And then Amy Cooper called 911. "There's an African-American man," she said, deliberately emphasizing his race, threatening me and my dog. She knew exactly what she was doing. She was weaponizing the police against a black man. She was invoking centuries of fear and prejudice. She was using the implicit threat that black men are dangerous, that they need to be controlled by authorities. Christian Cooper wasn't threatening her. He was exercising his right to use the park and asking her to follow the rules. But Amy Cooper understood that she could use his race against him. She could potentially get him arrested, injured, or killed by police simply by playing on racial fears. The incident was captured on video and went viral. Amy Cooper was fired from her job. She faced criminal charges, later dismissed. Christian Cooper, thankfully, wasn't harmed. But the incident revealed how, even in 2020, Central Park remained a site of racial tension. The viral moment sparked important conversations. People started learning about Seneca Village for the first time. They started understanding that Central Park's history was far more complicated than they'd been taught. The park wasn't just a triumph of democratic values. It was built on displacement and has been a site of exclusion throughout its existence. But here's the thing about resistance. Throughout all these years of discrimination and exclusion, marginalized New Yorkers never stopped claiming their right to the park. They kept showing up. They kept using it. They kept insisting that the park's democratic promises should be fulfilled. Black families continued to picnic in Central Park even when they faced harassment. Irish immigrants kept gathering even when park police tried to disperse them. LGBTQ people kept meeting in the Ramble even when it meant risking arrest. Working-class families kept bringing their children even when they were told their play was too rough. This resistance mattered. Over time, slowly, the park did become more inclusive. Not because the authorities suddenly became enlightened, but because people refused to be excluded. They forced the park to live up to its stated ideals through sheer persistence. The story of Central Park's exclusions isn't separate from its other dark history. It's all connected. The displacement of Seneca Village, the exploitation of workers, the corruption of Tammany Hall, the crimes committed in the park, the discrimination faced by marginalized groups, these are all parts of the same story. A story about power and who gets to use it. A story about whose visions matter and whose don't. A story about the gap between ideals and reality. Today, Central Park is more inclusive than ever before. You'll see people of every race, ethnicity, religion, sexual orientation, and class using the park. That's genuine progress. But it's progress that came despite the park's origins, not because of them. It came because people fought for it, and there are still echoes of the old exclusions. The park is better, maintained in areas near wealthy neighborhoods than in areas near poorer ones. Events and programs still tend to cater to people with money and leisure time. Homeless people are still pushed out, just as they've always been. The democratic ideal remains incomplete. But we're not done with the dark history yet. Because Central Park's story doesn't end with its construction and early years. The park has evolved over time, and that evolution has brought new challenges and controversies. To understand the full picture, we need to look at how the park has been managed and fought over in recent decades. Chapter 8. The Fight for the Park, Decline and Rebirth. By the 1960s, Central Park was in trouble. Serious trouble. The shiny vision that Olmsted and Vaux had created a century earlier was crumbling, literally. Let me explain what happened. New York City hit a financial crisis in the 1960s and 1970s. The city was losing population as middle-class families moved to the suburbs. The tax base shrank. City services were cut, and Central Park, which required constant maintenance, was neglected. The grass died in high-traffic areas, replaced by bare dirt. The sheep meadow, which had once been an actual meadow where sheep grazed, became a dust bowl. Graffiti covered bridges, buildings, and rocks. Trash piled up because the Parks Department couldn't afford enough workers to collect it all. Benches broke and weren't repaired. Lights went out and stayed out. Trees died and rotted where they fell. The park's water features were in terrible shape. The lake filled with algae. The pool became a stagnant, smelly mess. Fountains stopped working. The beautiful Bethesda Fountain, one of the park's signature features, deteriorated badly. Its angel statue was damaged, its basin cracked, its plumbing broken. Buildings fell into disrepair. The dairy, a charming Gothic revival structure where children had once gotten fresh milk, was abandoned and decaying. Belvedere Castle, which offered spectacular views, was closed because it wasn't safe. The boathouse was falling apart. Even the iconic Central Park Carousel, which had operated since the 1870s, was in rough shape. The park's paths and roads cracked and crumbled. Potholes appeared. Drainage systems failed, creating permanent puddles and muddy areas. In winter, snow removal was spotty at best. In summer, the lack of working water fountains made the park uncomfortable for visitors. Crime soared. With fewer park rangers and police, criminals operated more freely. The mugging rate increased dramatically. Assaults became common. Drug dealing was blatant in certain areas. After dark, large parts of the park were effectively off-limits to law-abiding citizens. The decline fed on itself. As the park became dirtier and more dangerous, fewer people used it. As fewer people used it, there was less political pressure to maintain it. As maintenance declined further, even fewer people wanted to visit. The park entered a death spiral. By the mid-1970s, some people were openly wondering if Central Park could be saved. There was talk about whether it might need to be partially or even fully closed. Some suggested turning parts of it over to private development. The park, that had cost millions to build, that had displaced communities and exploited workers, was falling apart. The city simply couldn't afford to maintain it properly. New York was on the verge of bankruptcy in 1975. Essential services like police, fire protection, and schools were being cut. A park, no matter how historically significant, wasn't a priority when the city was laying off teachers and closing firehouses. But some New Yorkers refused to accept the park's decline. They remembered what it had been. They believed it could be restored. And they were willing to put their own time and money into making that happen. In 1980, a group of civic leaders and philanthropists formed the Central Park Conservancy. This was a private, non-profit organization that would partner with the city to manage the park. The model was innovative, at least for New York. The Conservancy would raise private funds and use them to restore and maintain the park. They'd work with the Parks Department but would have significant independence. The Conservancy's first leader was Elizabeth Barlow Rogers. She'd been the city's Central Park administrator and had seen firsthand how badly the park had deteriorated. She believed that private funding and professional management could turn things around. She was right, but the solution came with complications we'll get to. The Conservancy started with some quick wins. They mobilized volunteers to clean up trash. They organized workdays where New Yorkers could help restore plantings and repair paths. They raised money for specific projects, like restoring the dairy and fixing the Bethesda fountain. The improvements were visible quickly. Within a few years, parts of the park looked dramatically better. The Great Lawn, which had been a dust bowl, was completely rebuilt with new drainage and irrigation systems. It took 2 years and $8 million, but when it reopened in 1997, it was spectacular. The Conservancy restored building after building. The dairy became the park's visitor center. Belvedere Castle reopened with exhibits about the park's natural environment. The boathouse was renovated and now houses a restaurant and boat rental facility. The Conservancy even brought in a new carousel, the 4th one in the park's history, which still operates today. They replanted thousands of trees and shrubs. They restored water features. They rebuilt paths and bridges. They installed better lighting. They created new programs for children, for adults, for school groups. They hired more park rangers and maintenance staff. By the early 2000s, Central Park looked better than it had in decades. Visitor numbers soared. People felt safe in the park again. The transformation was remarkable. The Conservancy became a model that other cities studied and tried to replicate. But here's where the complications come in. The Conservancy is funded primarily by wealthy donors. Individuals, foundations, and corporations contribute tens of millions of dollars every year. Some people give because they love the park. Some give because it's a prestigious cause, a way to be associated with one of New York's most famous landmarks. Some give because it's good business. Having your company's name on a restored building or program brings positive publicity. This funding model has allowed the park to be maintained at a very high level. The Conservancy's annual budget is over $70 million. They employ hundreds of people. They can afford to do things the cash-strapped Parks Department never could, but it's created a 2-tier system. Central Park gets excellent care because wealthy people fund it. Parks in poorer neighborhoods, like those in the Bronx or parts of Brooklyn, don't have wealthy benefactors. They don't have conservancies raising millions of dollars. They rely entirely on the city's Parks Department, which still doesn't have enough money. So you have this situation where one park, the park that serves Manhattan's wealthiest residents and attracts millions of tourists, gets world-class maintenance. Meanwhile, neighborhood parks in working-class areas are still struggling with broken equipment, overgrown plantings, and inadequate staffing. Critics argue this reproduces exactly the kind of inequality that Central Park was supposedly created to address. The park was meant to be democratic, available to all. But if it gets better funding than other parks because it's in a wealthy area and serves wealthy people, is that really democratic? The Conservancy responds that they've shown what's possible. Their success demonstrates that parks can be well maintained if properly funded. They argue that cities should fund all parks at similar levels. They're not responsible for the fact that other parks lack resources. That's true, as far as it goes. But it doesn't address the fundamental issue. The Conservancy's model works precisely because Central Park is special. It's iconic. It attracts wealthy donors who want to be associated with it. You can't replicate that for every neighborhood park. Most parks will never have that kind of cachet or those kinds of donors. There's also a question about influence. When wealthy donors give millions of dollars to the Conservancy, do they get a say in how the park is managed? Not officially. The Conservancy's board makes decisions based on park needs, not donor preferences. But there's an inherent conflict of interest. Major donors have access. They're listened to. If their vision for the park differs from what working-class New Yorkers want, whose vision wins? Let me give you an example. In recent years, there's been debate about how to manage the park's Great Lawn. Should it host large concerts and events, which bring in revenue but damage the grass? Or should it be preserved primarily for passive recreation, keeping it pristine but limiting its use? The Conservancy has leaned toward limiting events. They argue it's about protecting the lawn. Critics suggest it's also about protecting the experience that wealthy donors want. A quiet, beautiful park without the noise and crowds that come with big events. Working-class New Yorkers, who might enjoy free concerts in the park, have less say in this decision. Another controversy involves the park's policies toward homeless people. The Conservancy has supported increased enforcement to remove people living in the park. They frame this as necessary for park safety and visitor comfort. But advocates for the homeless argue it's criminalizing poverty, pushing vulnerable people out of one of the few spaces where they can find some shelter. The Conservancy would say they're just trying to maintain the park for all users. But all users often means users who can afford homes. The homeless people being pushed out are also New Yorkers with as much theoretical right to the park as anyone else. But they don't have wealthy allies. They don't donate millions of dollars. So their interests are secondary. These tensions came to a head in 2018. Proposals were made to modify how the Conservancy partnership worked, potentially giving the nonprofit even more control over park management. Progressive politicians and advocates pushed back. They argued the park was becoming too privatized, too focused on serving wealthy donors rather than all New Yorkers. The debate exposed the uncomfortable truth. Central Park is technically public, owned by the city, managed for the benefit of all. But in practice, it's heavily influenced by private interests. The people who fund it have more say in its future than the average New Yorker does. This isn't necessarily malicious. The Conservancy has done genuinely good work. The park is objectively better maintained because of them. Millions of people enjoy a more beautiful, safer park thanks to their efforts. But the model raises fundamental questions about public space and who it truly serves. Let's zoom out for a moment. Central Park's history is, in many ways, the history of American cities. It starts with displacement of marginalized communities. It's built through exploitation of workers and corruption of politicians. It reflects the racial and class tensions of its era. It declines when cities face fiscal crises. It's revived through an uneasy partnership between public and private interests. At every stage, there's a gap between the democratic ideal and the unequal reality. The park is supposed to be for everyone, but it's always served some people better than others. The people with power, the people with money, they've always had more say in how the park is used and maintained. And yet, despite all this, the park matters. It genuinely does provide benefits to millions of people. Working-class New Yorkers use it and love it. Immigrants find community there. Children play there. Elderly people find peace there. The park is imperfect, compromised by its history and its funding model, but it's also genuinely valuable. That's the uncomfortable complexity of Central Park. It can be both a site of historical injustice and a beloved public resource. It can be both a symbol of inequality and a place where people of different backgrounds come together. It can be both a triumph and a tragedy. As we move toward the end of our journey through Central Park's dark history, we need to ask, what should we do with this knowledge? How should understanding the park's true history change how we think about it, use it, and maintain it? Chapter 9. Memory and Reckoning. What we owe the past. Here's a question. When you walk through Central Park today, should you think about Seneca Village? Should you remember the workers? Who died building the paths you're on? Should you consider the corruption that inflated costs? Should you reflect on the discrimination that shaped who felt welcome there? Or should you just enjoy the park? Should you let yourself appreciate the beauty without dwelling on the darkness? There's no easy answer. Both responses are valid in their own way. but I'd argue that knowing the dark history makes the park more meaningful, not less. Let me explain why. In 1992, when Roy Rosenzweig and Elizabeth Blackmar published The Park and the People, they uncovered Seneca Village's story for a general audience. Before their book, most New Yorkers had never heard of Seneca Village. The community had been erased not just physically but from memory. That erasure was convenient. If you don't know that a thriving black community was destroyed to build the park, it's easier to celebrate the park as an unalloyed triumph. You can focus on Olmsted's genius, on the democratic vision, on the beauty of the landscape. The uncomfortable questions don't arise. But Rosenzweig and Blackmar's work meant the erasure couldn't continue. Historians, archaeologists, and community members began asking questions. What exactly had happened to Seneca Village? Where had its residents gone? What could archaeological evidence tell us about how they'd lived? The answers were fragmentary. Too much time had passed. Too many records had been lost or never kept in the first place. But enough emerged to make Seneca Village real again, not just as a historical footnote, but as a place where people had built lives and dreams. In 2001, the Central Park Conservancy installed the first historical marker acknowledging Seneca Village. It's located near West 85th Street, in the area where the village once stood. The marker tells the basic story: a community of African Americans and immigrants, property owners and working people, destroyed to make way for the park. Some people criticize the marker as too little, too late. A small sign after nearly 150 years of erasure? That hardly seemed adequate. But others saw it as an important first step. Memory has to start somewhere. In 2011, the archaeological digs began. Teams from Columbia University and the City University of New York excavated areas where Seneca Village had stood. They dug carefully, using screens to sift through soil, looking for any artifacts that might have survived. What they found was remarkable. Fragments of plates and cups, buttons and pieces of clothing, tools and household items, the sole of a child's shoe. Each artifact was a connection to real people who'd lived real lives. The archaeologists treated each find with reverence, knowing these objects were all that remained of a lost community. The digs generated media attention. Newspapers ran stories about Seneca Village. TV news covered the excavations. Slowly, public awareness grew. New Yorkers started learning that the park they loved had a more complicated history than they'd known. In 2019, the Conservancy went further. They installed more extensive signage throughout the former Seneca Village area. These signs marked where churches had stood, where homes had been, where gardens had flourished. They included information about specific residents, naming names and telling individual stories. The signs also included QR codes that visitors could scan with their phones to access more detailed information. There were walking tour guides, both printed and digital, that let people trace the boundaries of the lost village. The Conservancy created educational programs about Seneca Village for schools. This represents real progress in memory work, but it also raises questions. Is signage enough? Does acknowledging past wrongs absolve us of responsibility to address their ongoing effects? Consider this. The descendants of Seneca Village residents lost more than just their homes. They lost generational wealth. Property ownership in Manhattan, even in the 1850s, would have been incredibly valuable over time. If those families had been able to hold on to their land, their descendants today would likely be wealthy. Instead, they were compensated at rates that didn't reflect the land's true value, and they were scattered to neighborhoods where building equivalent wealth was far more difficult. There's an economic cost to what happened to Seneca Village that compounds over generations. The descendants of those displaced residents are still, in a sense, paying the price. Should they be compensated? Should there be reparations of some kind? These are uncomfortable questions. The people who made the decision to destroy Seneca Village are long dead. The residents who were displaced are also gone. At what point does historical injustice become too far in the past to address? But African American activists and historians argue that the effects aren't in the past, they're ongoing. The wealth gap between white and black Americans has its roots in exactly these kinds of injustices. Property seizure, unfair compensation, forced displacement, these things happened over and over again to black communities. Seneca Village is just one example among many. Should Central Park be viewed as stolen land? Should there be a formal acknowledgement of the injustice done to Seneca Village residents? Should their descendants have any special rights or recognition in relation to the park? There's no consensus on these questions. The Conservancy has focused on education and memory, telling the story more completely. That's valuable. But some people argue it's not enough. Memory without material restitution is incomplete. Let's talk about the workers. We know thousands of men labored to build Central Park. We know many were injured. We know some died. We know they were exploited and underpaid, but we don't know most of their names. They're anonymous, forgotten. Should there be a memorial to these workers? Should the park acknowledge not just the designers, but the laborers who actually built it? Some historians have proposed exactly this: a monument that recognizes the immigrant workers, the black laborers, the men who moved millions of cubic yards of earth and placed millions of stones. Such a memorial would change how we understand the park. It would shift attention from the genius of individual designers to the collective labor of thousands of working people. It would acknowledge that the park wasn't created through vision alone, but through backbreaking physical work. But there's resistance to this idea. Some people worry that emphasizing the dark history makes the park less appealing. They argue that focusing on injustice and suffering detracts from the park's beauty and purpose. Why burden visitors with uncomfortable truths when they just want to enjoy nature? This resistance reveals something important. We're uncomfortable with complexity. We want our public spaces to have simple, uplifting stories. The park is beautiful. Therefore, its creation must have been good. But history is rarely that simple. The park is beautiful. That's true. It's also true that its creation involved injustice, exploitation, and corruption. Both things can be true simultaneously. Acknowledging the dark history doesn't erase the park's value. It enriches our understanding. Think about how we approach other historical sites. We don't avoid talking about slavery when we visit former plantations in the South. We don't ignore the Trail of Tears when we discuss American westward expansion. We've learned, slowly and imperfectly, that historical sites should tell complete stories, not sanitized ones. Central Park deserves the same approach. Visitors should know about Olmsted and Vaux's design genius. They should also know about Seneca Village. They should appreciate the beauty of the Ramble. They should also understand that it was created by exploited workers. They should enjoy the Great Lawn. They should also remember that Boss Tweed stole money intended for the park's construction. Complete history doesn't diminish. It deepens. It makes the park more meaningful because it connects to larger American stories about race, class, immigration, labor, corruption, and democracy. There's another aspect of memory work that matters: understanding how the park's history shapes its present. The Conservancy's funding model, dominated by wealthy donors, has historical roots. The tradition of private control over supposedly public space goes back to the park's origins when elite New Yorkers made decisions that displaced poor communities. The park's continued inequalities, better maintenance than parks in poor neighborhoods, policies that exclude homeless people, programming that caters to people with money and leisure time, these aren't accidents. They're continuations of patterns established from the beginning. If we understand this history, we can challenge these patterns. We can demand that all city parks receive adequate funding, not just the ones in wealthy areas. We can question policies that criminalize poverty. We can push for programming that serves diverse communities. We can insist that the park's democratic promises be fulfilled. But if we don't know the history, if we think the park has always been a simple democratic triumph, then we can't see these patterns. The injustices become invisible, just part of how things are. Let me tell you about Andrew Williams IV again, the man who discovered he was a descendant of Seneca Village's original property owner. When he learned about his connection to the village, he described feeling a sense of pride and belonging. He said it made him walk taller. That's what memory work can do. It connects people to their history. It helps them understand where they come from. It gives them a sense of place and identity. For African Americans whose history has been so often erased or distorted, this is especially important. But Williams also described a sense of loss. His great-great-great-grandfather had owned property in Manhattan. That property, if it had stayed in the family, would have made them wealthy. Instead, it was taken. The family was scattered. The wealth was never built. Williams benefits from knowing his history, but he also bears the burden of understanding what was lost. This is the double edge of memory. It empowers and it grieves. It connects us to the past and reminds us of past injustices. It's uncomfortable, but it's necessary. Schools in New York are starting to teach more complete versions of Central Park's history. Students learn about Seneca Village alongside Olmsted and Vaugh. They discuss the displacement, the labor, the corruption. They grapple with difficult questions about justice and progress. This is exactly what should happen. Young people need to understand that history is complex, that progress often comes with costs, that the stories we've been told aren't always complete. They need to learn to think critically about public spaces and who they serve. The work of memory and reckoning continues. In 2025, conversations are ongoing about how to better acknowledge Central Park's full history. There are proposals for additional memorials, expanded educational programming, and more comprehensive historical markers throughout the park. Some activists have proposed renaming sections of the park to honor Seneca Village residents or the workers who built it. Others want to see material reparations for descendants of displaced communities. Still, others focus on making the park more equitable in its present-day operations. These conversations are healthy. They're signs that we're willing to confront uncomfortable truths, but they're also contentious. People disagree about how much emphasis to put on dark history versus celebration of the park's achievements. They disagree about whether material reparations are appropriate. They disagree about how to balance memory with enjoyment. What's not in dispute is that the old narrative, the simple story of visionary designers creating a democratic paradise, is dead. We can't go back to that innocent understanding. We know too much. The question now is what we do with that knowledge. I'd argue we need to hold two ideas together. First, Central Park's creation involved serious injustices that should be acknowledged and, where possible, addressed. Second, the park today provides genuine value to millions of people and deserves to be protected and enjoyed. These aren't contradictory. We can appreciate what the park is while being honest about how it came to be. We can enjoy its beauty while remembering those who paid the price for it. We can use it while working to make it more equitable. That's what memory and reckoning require. Not tearing down the park or feeling guilty every time we visit it, but knowing the full story, telling the complete truth, and using that understanding to build something better.